Welcome, Book Club session number 1. Nice multinational audience today. There are a few countries in the world we haven't hit, but we've added the UK to our mix. The fifth discipline. I thought we might start before we get buried by, like, if you went 2 minutes for just the two things that have stood out most to you with the piece of the fifth discipline you've reread so far, what would they be? 2-minute highlights of what you've read so far.
There's a lot. So I'm partway through part 2, and I think the biggest immediate takeaway for me was the density of the introduction to the revised edition. Things that 15 years ago when I first read this, I just didn't care about, didn't recognize, didn't have the background and the history. As I'm looking at it today and reading it now, I'm like, all the context comes rushing at me where he's coming from and where he's at. So I think I'm just looking at my highlights and I've got like 2 per page for the first 20 pages of that intro. Um, and I think the second big thing that goes through is the inherent handling of complexity that's interwoven into the entirety. It's not represented in the complexity language that's in vogue in our community right now, but like as I read it and I read about the dynamicism and the handling of the emergent that he talks about at the beginning of part 2, it's just it's rich how much is actually there and already talked about without resorting to today's complexity authors or Cynefin or anything else. It's all already tucked in there, and it's not nearly as systemic and predictive as a lot of people make it out to be. Those are my 2 big
Beautiful.
takeaways so far.
How about you, Mr. Evo?
I thought it's such a long time ago since that book was written. And I know it's been revised, but I was thinking that the situations in that book from the 1980s, it's like so many cycles away now. and it's fascinating because it was a lot of stuff was going on in that at that time. That book, when it first came out, was laying down a lot of the foundations of some really cool stuff that's now very sophisticated. I just keep thinking that, wow, I mean, that there's all these things he says, but there's like not a lot under them at that point in time because they just hadn't been developed hugely. It was very good, and it was very early on, and it's very interesting to see some of the contemporaries of what was going on at that time as well. But I just keep thinking to myself, wow, it was such a long time ago now. But it's fascinating that it's a very good book. I hadn't read it before, so it's really, really good.
Nice. Michael?
I would want to call attention to the things that I didn't even pick up on first time around that surprised me, if I'm honest. So therefore it was worthy of another pass for sure. And 2 things I'll call out. One is he spends a lot of time in the first part of the book talking about this idea that I am my position. It's not something I do, that is what I am. That actually, we if we're not careful, we get so intricately woven into our job titles, our functions, and what we do, that it can become extremely limiting, I think, if we're not careful. So that was one that it kept sort of causing wheels to turn in my mind. And the second one is a smaller point perhaps, but it was interesting to me that he coined a term metanoia, which is a fancy word for a change of mind. And, gosh, we struggle sometimes for language there on that. Is it mindset? Is it knowledge? Is it the shift? Is it a paradigm shift, to quote Thomas Kuhn? What's going on here? And it's just quite interesting to me that I don't think I've seen that term be used by anybody else, anywhere else in the agile space. I'm not saying it's a missed opportunity or not, but I latched onto it when I saw it and I went, that's interesting. didn't even pop for me the first time I saw that. I must have said, I don't know what that is. I'm going to move on. So those are my initial thoughts.
Wolfgang?
Thank you, Michael. So, for me, when I took the book, it was I actually I thought I've never read it before. This was my initial thought. Have I ever read that book? No, probably not. Then I started to read the book, and then I thought maybe yes. And after a while, uh, I recognized a lot of the stories. And so I remembered that I already read the book years ago, but at that point in time, I read so many books that I actually didn't really remember reading that book. But the more I read, the more I understood, or the more I had a feeling of how much that influenced me. Even though, like, I used even stories from the book in my safe trainings, like the one story where when you're under a shower and then you try to get the water warmer and you're not waiting long enough. So this was really something that I used in a lot of trainings. I couldn't even remember where that story came from. It was just there and it made a lot of sense. And also other stories. And so this was quite fascinating, like reading a book a second time where I didn't really have any remembrance reading that book, but actually it influenced me on a very deep level, obviously, where I had a lot of concepts that I even expressed like as it's written in the book, even though I couldn't really remember reading it. So this was fascinating for me. And now that I'm reading it the second time, of course, I'm reading the second edition, but I'm reading it in French. So this it also changes, like when you change the language, reading that, it also changes like the perspective. And this is also fascinating because even though the stories are the same, it's different when you read it in a different language.
So I've got to ask, knowing that you listen to it and then you read it, are you listening to it in German and then reading it in French before you talk about it in English, or
So actually, I would have loved to listen to it in another language, but the audiobook is only available in English, so I have to listen to it in English and then I can read it in a different language.
so when I sat for a few minutes last night going, how do we kick off? Because I know our plan today was to talk about it all the way to the end of part 2. And then when I started collecting my thoughts in the Miro, I went, oh my goodness, there is so much to talk about. And we'll come up with the 2-minute, get us warmed up. And listening to all of you and going last was great because I battled so much to go, what are my top 2 insights? Pick this, pick that. And you've already mentioned all of, like, 3/4 of what I came up with. So my 2. Number 1 was I want to start facilitating the beer game. I've never facilitated it. I've read about it lots of times. I reread about it a few weeks ago when I was creating my LPM boot camp because I thought maybe I'd run that in the LPM boot camp, and I wound up not doing it. But when I read his dissection of it, I was like, I want to learn how to facilitate the beer game. It's just too cool not to be using. Have any of you facilitated it just while we're on the way through? There we go. So I'm not alone. I was half worried Eric was going to go, oh, yeah, I've run it 50 times. And number 2 for me was, I think, a little bit about complacency for myself. When I got into sort of deep into number 2 and the systems archetypes and the modeling, I went, it's a long time since I've actually gone and deliberately drawn systems models for an organization. And I've got to the point where I feel like I intuit them, right? And I think naturally about the organization through a systems lens. But then he had this quote, and I haven't quite memorized it, but it was like the wood, seeing the wood for the trees. And he said, we often talk about stepping back to see the wood for the trees. But then what often happens is that we see our two favorite trees. So, even though notionally we've stepped back, all we're seeing is our two favorite trees. And I went, gee, how often do I fall prey to seeing the things that I'm looking to see in the system, as opposed to employing the discipline of mapping it to find things. So those are my two.
Has everybody gone, Mark?
Everybody has.
Yeah, I'd love to build on it, what you were touching on there, if that's okay.
Please
I
do.
didn't want to prevent anybody else from talking first. I think that wood for the trees, the systems thinking, and of course the fifth discipline is talking about is systems thinking in the book when we eventually get to that, and it's mentioned in the opening section. But for me, a profound insight in the book, and he does it so well, is the importance of the feedback loop and the different types of feedback loop that there are to be observed here. There's the runaway, the two main types are the runaway and then the reinforcing feedback loop. And you can quite easily see both of these working in organizations. And that's a little bit of a shift, from some of the training that I do, for instance, by the book. Systems thinking is really the emphasis is heavily into seeing the whole and being able to see that large picture. We don't do quite as good a job, I don't think, to calling out the importance of those feedback loops, which really drive the system and describe what sort of system we're actually dealing with here, and fundamentally some of the behaviors but that are caused by those feedback loops. Hence the beer garden exercise being a really good way to see that happening in action and be surprised by that. But that took me down a new path of systems thinking when I read the book. So I got into a lot of other authors and read a lot of other books directly of a consequence of Senge, Peter Senge, making it clear there's a lot more than meets the eye here from the point of view of the systems view as systems thinking.
Could not agree more. But to be a little structured, I thought what we might do is zoom back and just start at the beginning. So I don't know how you've all caught your notes. I know I've caught mine in the mirror. I saw somebody else had put a post on the Miro that said, this is no longer empty. Was that you, Eric?
That was me. I hate going to an empty mural board and like trying to zoom around and figure out where the content is, only to discover there is none. So I always put one post-it in the middle of an empty canvas just to see what 100% looks like. It's like, how do you say, avoid that like 2% zoom and all that.
So if we decide we want to screen share, we'll screen share. I'm going to, in our figuring out what we are with 5 heads instead of 4 and no prearranged scenes, I'm going to stay in just the chat mode for the minute. I was like you, Eric. I got worried about how much I was highlighting in the introduction, because I know my process when I read a book is I highlight it in the Kindle, I collect my quotes into a Miro, I start to arrange them and annotate them, and that's the way I digest it in the end. And I'm sitting there going, it feels like I'm highlighting half of every page. In fact, I had pages where I highlighted, the top third and the bottom third of the page. And it's like, what's going on here? I'm highlighting more than I'm leaving empty. Because there was just so much density of insight in the introduction. Just blew me away. And I forget, it might have been Eric, but that stuff, I think it was you when you were talking about the introduction. The stuff you weren't yet ready to recognize as important the first time you read the book. you know, I read Senge the first time so early in my journey down this path, and looking at it again, it's like, yeah, I just wasn't ready to see it. So you mentioned, obviously, you highlighted it hard, Eric. Big things that stood out to you from the introduction, like when you sorted out the themes of your highlights.
I didn't do a lot of post-processing explicitly, but some of the things that taught me were the ones that stuck with me from my first read as well. And it's one of those, like, I don't know if this is where I picked it up from or if it's something that I just found elsewhere, but I loved his phrase, our prevailing system of management has destroyed our people. People are born with intrinsic motivation, self-respect, dignity, curiosity to learn, joy in learning. The voices of destruction begin with toddlers. And for years, like probably 3 or 4 years in, my Agile Alliance profile was all about trying to recapture the curiosity of childhood and undoing the damage caused in a lot of ways by being plotted through at least the American institutionalized learning systems, and like having to unlearn a lot of that and find that curiosity and intrinsic motivation sums it up, but like the personal mindset. And then I think about that writ large and look at some of my clients, and it's like, yeah, wow.
The call out he made there about the way that the educational system planted that, and you know, Deming's sort of later life focus on that was a fascinating one to me, right? That whole everything that is perceived as broken and dysfunctional in our corporate world is implanted in our education system. And the thought of, you know, until you fix the education system, you're never going to fix the rest of the world. I thought that was a really interesting linkage.
I think that in part, though, I think that's a function of the fact that, for the most part, the education system was designed to produce people to join the workforce. The education is designed to get a job. It sort of went hand in hand with the Industrial Revolution in some respects, lagged a little bit. But that was the goal, at least I think for a lot of institutions and how they came up and came about. It was producing people to join either the workforce or in some cases the military, and go and do wonderful things there, whatever that means. And I think we're taking a good, long, hard look now at, can that still be its sole purpose? Is that part of its purpose, but it has to be more than that.
I mean, that gets into a whole debate on probably country-specific education approaches if we go down that path.
That could be. Well, let's do a quick poll. If you think about the call out that he was making about the way the education system primes what becomes evidenced as dysfunction in organisations in later life. If I look at the Australian education system, I would say by and large, yes, 100% agree. Same in Germany.
His quote is,
Absolutely.
his quote is in highlights. You will never transform the prevailing system of management without transforming a prevailing system of education. They are the same system.
About the UK, Dave, since we're country polling.
I mean, you know, education's a very. Is it fit for purpose in this country? Well, I don't think it is. I mean, no. But the world's moving so fast that how can these large traditional systems possibly keep pace with society that's changing so rapidly? But no, it's not. Can't. No.
There was an interesting linkage there and I think he talked about it a little bit later in the introduction, where he called out the fact that businesses can change and experiment far more rapidly than other systems. And he referred back to education and government, and the various constraints on their ability to experiment and evolve versus the capability of an organization. And it's an interesting one, right? Because he's talking about really big organizations that he's talking to there, which we would normally think of as, hard to change. And, by and large, the rest of the book talks about them being hard to change. But that interesting parallel back to, and you think about something like, let's say, learning styles. All the work that we do in terms of teaching versus learning, triggering the learning appetite, experiential learning versus training for the back of the room versus lecturing, right? And then you look at the way the schooling system works. And by and large, the schooling system is still teaching rather than creating learners. I've had 3 kids go through it in recent years. I've got one who's about a month from done with high school. And the last one has gone to a school that I remember where he went to his first week there. And he came back and he said, "Oh, Dad, you're going to love this school because they do all kinds of stuff that sounds like what you do to your people." and he took me through all, do too, yeah. Well, at that age, that was the way he thought about it. But he talked about all of these experiential things they'd taken them through to kind of prime them for a different way of learning. But then his 2 older sisters were stuck in, we're going to lecture at you, give you homework, and train you to parrot back what we've lectured at you. And that was the learning cycle they went through. And
I think there is.
Sorry,
Mark.
Michael. Okay.
I want to let you finish your thought because that's
No, go. Jump.
I think there's an additional dimension in this too, which is sort of being called out when he quotes Deming, which is what we're actually teaching our youngsters is to compete. Right? When at school, you're in a competition to get what best in the class. The honors are going to be handed out to certain kids. Athletics, right? Winners and losers. And is competition? I'm going to sound like I'm about to say something heretical here for a minute, but is competition what we're really looking for, or is it collaboration when we get into the workplace? Because I think we're setting people up to go from the school to the workplace. They take all of the lessons they've learned, and of course we're all bristling with the desire to compete, possibly at the expense of others around her, and we fundamentally lose the understanding of that need of how important it is to collaborate. And of course that dovetails into team learning, which I'm going to potentially go ahead and I won't do that now. But I think that aspect of competition, I think that's important, and he calls that out, and I think that's damaging in the long run because we no longer have that's not our bias. In many cases, at least, our bias is not to collaborate. Our bias is to compete and be competitive.
Well, he also mentions a really bad thing is short-term metrics. So when you set short-term metrics, you tend to encourage bad behavior, and a lot of education has turned into like, are you doing well? Let's change the metrics to see whether or not you're doing well. So a lot of the way that education is being forced to rank everybody is also generating quite bad behaviors, I think, in all parts of that system. So I think that's another really important thing is when you've got all of the exams and schools are competing against each other. That's not a very healthy way to bring up kids through that kind of crazy system.
The one aspect which I really thought about in the last days was that he says personal learning starts with your personal vision, and it's something that is unique to you, and you have to find that out yourself. And in the school system, at least as I perceived it, and I'm now perceiving it as my children are going through that again. So it's not even like it's not encouraged, yeah, okay. But when you are starting developing your own vision, it's even like damaging for yourself sometimes. You have something in mind and you may have best intentions with the vision that you have, but you are not fitting into the system anymore. And so it can be that you getting hurt, so to speak, emotionally, when you're starting to come up with a vision on your own. And for me, this is a vicious cycle. Like, if we are not able to teach the children, the pupils, to create a vision on their own, to find their own passion, their own vision, then they will always just repeat what we give them, and they will never find the satisfaction in trying to accomplish something that comes from themselves.
Let's chat a bit about, my notes call it Senge's distillation of Deming's system of management critique. So the whole, management by measurement, compliance-based cultures, managing outcomes. I actually might switch into screen share mode for a minute for that. The drill through that he went on sort of his distillation of the way Deming's thinking changed late in Deming's life. And I read through all those lists and I went, can I think of a client in the large enterprise space who is not just completely described by that list? And I went, I'm not sure that I can. And there was a piece where you go, we think the world's changed. And then you look back at this that was written a long time ago. That was a distillation of something that Deming wrote a long time before that. And you go, man, it's still true. And I haven't been, like, part of my homework in continuing to post-process is going back to Deming's 14 points and going, it'd be interesting to trace that against the 14 points. Because that notion that he shares in the intro about the way Deming's thinking shifted, like I'd never realised Deming shifted away from TQM late in life, and that he changed his public stance. So it's like, well, that's an interesting thing. I'd never been aware of it. I don't think I knew who Deming was the first time I read the Fifth Discipline. But, it was, I looked at it and went, oh, I'd love to do a mapping against the 14 points. But wow, it's powerful as a distillation.
That's a bit I highlighted almost instantly, that bit.
The question that I wanted to play with it though, right? And I'll tell you the thought process that ran through my head as I read it. Actually, no, it was as I was putting together the notes. I thought instantly of going, I want to send a copy of this to one of my clients who, as a leader, she does not have any of these dysfunctions, I'll tell you now. But she's in a situation where she's surrounded by them. And I went, I just want to send her this and go, recognize these things. And then I stopped and I went, what would that do for her other than ruin the start of her day? So I didn't send it to her. But that was probably the thing that jumped to me is it's easy to look at that and go, yes, it's depressing. And yes, you could hold it up as a mirror. But acknowledging it as a fascinating distillation and then using it for good are two different things. Did any of you guys think about sort of, if you took that set of insights and man, you could make a nice punchy deck and, challenge, talk about them. Then if you think about how you could use those in a constructive way with a client?
I have, and I actually, I think it was the second Safe Summit. I gave a talk on the learning organization, which was basically a distillation of the insights which I took away from the book. I'd have to dust that off and bring that up if anyone's curious to see it. It's not going to shock you and surprise you, but it was, the intent was to provide both a bit of insight and give people hope rather than depress them. Because I think there's so many places in the book where you go, gosh, that's interesting. Not only is it interesting, it's also quite useful. And I'll share one of the most useful things that he at least hints at it. Very, very early in the book, he talks about we can't just, and then he cites him, we can't just depend anymore on a Ford, on a Henry Ford, and he's got other names too, who are going to figure everything out and tell everybody else what to do. Alan Ward does a fantastic job of this topic too, just for the record. I'm not trying to show off, but he does. The situation that Ford has with the people he had around him in Detroit called for a certain system that was going to work, a certain approach. Yes, very, very mechanical, very sort of metrics, very passionate about TQM and so on and so forth. By contrast, the problem, for instance, at Toyota was fundamentally different from the one that Ford has. And Toyota, they really didn't have much of a choice. They had to be a learning organization. And I don't want to take us too deep down a rat hole there, but that could this be useful? Have I thought about sharing it? Have I thought about giving it to? I have done so in the past, and I don't want to start claiming, and it was the panacea for all of the problems they were having. But it's incredibly enlightening for others to see.
Anybody else? Thoughts to add on that one?
I tend to use these kind of problem-centric lists more on the diagnostic side than on the generative repair side. So I hadn't put a lot of thought into how to flip it per se. A lot of these negative lists are problem-centric lists. I won't call them negative; they're discernment tools. But a lot of them, I struggle to find any punchiness with the flip side.
Yeah.
So if you turn the language around and it's like, celebrate diversity. Yes, of course we're celebrating diversity. No, actually you're celebrating uniformity, but that's not going to be helpful. So I think to come at it from a list derived from this even starts to risk anchoring it in the current more so than helping provide the new disciplines that unlock the future, unlock new tools.
I certainly know. I've seen Deming's 14 points used in a very weaponized way a few times.
Mhm.
Let me give you shock and awe. Here's half an hour on the 14 points. Look in the mirror. And I've seen a few folks do that. And, it makes for a great talk, but it doesn't really ever turn into anything.
I forget which of you said it a little bit ago, because I completely agree. And I'm looking at the distillation and a few of the quotes I have highlighted over here. And one of you said something about none of this matters without the vision elements as part of your overview and welcome, and how much that struck you.
Yeah.
And I keep coming back to that. It's just the list doesn't have the vision connection.
It kind of, I looked at it and I went, if I went, what's actionable? It was this notion of going, these are the dysfunctions and the only way out is to become a learning organization. Um, and maybe there's a world where you could treat it as a diagnostic to say you could measure some level of progress down the learning organization path by reduction in the dysfunction. Um,
So this is how I usually approach that. It's like I mean I'm an engineer by heart, and so like the mechanical stuff is the thing that interests me. Like, what are the mechanics within an organization? How is it? What is the communication and collaboration mechanics? What is the structure behind that? And so I try to when I try to help companies getting better at that, I try to come up with structures, communication and collaboration structures that are like that don't that are not going in that direction. So this is what I'm striving for. Am I successful with that? I don't know, to a degree, hopefully. But at least this is like a North Star for me, saying, okay, I don't want to have these, I don't want to encourage this, how should I say, disabilities of an organization. I want to encourage the opposite. And how do structures look like within which the people then are working and collaborating together, which is actually encouraging the opposite thing? So, I mean, I'm still on the way, and as I said before we started the stream, I learned a lot today, even about that. So I'm learning every day, but today it was like shocking for me. It was like, oh, okay, I missed some fundamental points in that. So I'm this is something that I'm striving to do every day.
It strikes me
I
that.
always think.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that it's interesting with that list of things that, like, I always think experiential learning, where you teach them that some of those bad things are bad, and you teach them in a scenario where there's a way of looking at it in a very opposite way. So the experience of, like, I don't know, like say you have an exercise that teaches them something that some of these natural things just come out, but you show them that there's a way to negate those things by actually doing something in a certain way. That, for me, I've always found that's the most powerful way to get inroads into helping people think differently, by showing them, doing them an exercise, letting them go down the route of some of those negative traits, and then like flipping them back into a way that shows them how to do it collaboratively or in a better way. And I always find that's a really useful way to try and, but you can't do all of them at once. You've got to do lots of little sessions. But you know, I think that for me is a phenomenal way to get the light bulb to come on to people.
that's an interesting thinking about creating little experiential cycles to play with those. That's an interesting one, Dave. You got my brain wiring now. You know me. Find me a game to play.
Well, I'd love to see the beer game. I mean, that was a fascinating way of like showing these problems coming out, and then people going, "Oh, I did not know. I was going to be blaming everybody else." That would be fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah, I did check out the online implementation of that beer game, and it looks pretty interesting. Didn't actually use it in the field. And one thing just a thought that occurred to me though is, assuming we're staying true to this being about part one, you know, as the setup titled "How Our Actions Create Our Reality and How We Can Change It," it might be a little unfair to expect out of a section deliberately taking a very high level of abstraction initial run at a problem to expect from that, okay, here are all the useful specific tools coming out of this, what is a setup to make the argument that we need to start thinking about a learning organization. And I think it's in the later sections where I found things that were genuinely very, very useful for me that I've used in the field.
Yeah, there's no doubt though that the tools come later. I think for me, and again, just as I was assembling it, he does a lot of nice linkage later in life. Like if you think about the way that he links the beer game to the 7 learning dysfunctions or the 7 learning disabilities, that was, you know, his whole debrief on the beer game was brilliant that way to go. Well, I did a whole chapter on the 7 learning disabilities, And by the way, in the debrief from the beer game, here's the 7 learning disabilities and how they show up, right? So the clear linkage was brilliant. But I haven't yet, and I've been disciplined in like stopping when we agreed we were going to stop on the book read. But I haven't seen him going back to the Deming distillation. The connections he's drawing later in the book are more to his own models than they are to the Deming distillation. And his own models are super powerful in themselves, but that was kind of the question thread for me. But shall we move to chapter 1? So if I'm going to go back into screen share mode on the stream for a minute. That beginning concept, right? And this chapter 1's the kind of leverage learning 5 disciplines chapter. But that beginning concept he had of invention versus innovation. And, I think the quote was, engineers say that new idea has been invented when it's proven to work in the laboratory. The idea becomes an innovation only when it can be replicated reliably on a meaningful scale at practical costs. And then that notion of the key for it to evolve is actually the creation of the ensemble of a set of component technologies. I obviously paid no attention to that the first time I read it, because I read it and I went, I've never seen anybody separate invention from innovation like that. And it struck me because we talk about innovation so much, that creating that mental model of invention versus innovation, it's like, that's a really interesting take. Did that hit anybody else?
Yes. Yep.
Yeah, I marked that also.
If we're talking about the same section too, he talks about the learning organization. While it might have been invented, it's not yet been innovated.
Yeah, it was his setup for the notion that the 5 disciplines is the ensemble that comes together to create the learning organization.
Right.
That was really his segue. He went, okay, invent an idea. Innovate is assembling a collection of invented ideas. And then he told his first example was the DC-3. And he said, the Wright brothers invented flight, but we didn't move to the innovation of commercial flight until the Wright brothers collected an assembly of 5 key component technologies, and I think it was retractable landing gear and flaps on the wings, and I forget the other 3. But that the DC-3 was the thing that brought those 5 things together to enable us to get to innovation, and then the notion of the innovation becomes something that you can actually apply at scale, right? And it becomes practical. And then his jump from there was to go, hey, we've got these 5 key disciplines. And funnily enough, although systems thinking is the 5th discipline, it's the first one he talks about in the ensemble. And if you put these 5 things together, I think that lets us take the idea of a learning organization from an invention to an innovation. That was kind of the core arc of the thread in the chapter as I read it.
It's interesting. I have a couple different responses, but just putting it on the share up here, it's interesting where else we might have seen such a perspective.
So I've just zoomed over to what you dropped. Do you want to talk more, or just drop a challenging comment with a visual of Eric?
I think I just want to leave it there. It's like it's a competency-based view. It's a discipline-based view. But I've been thinking a lot about these assemblages of how you put things together and what's necessary across a bunch of different dimensions to drive success. And I was talking to somebody outside the safe community this morning, and I was like, yeah, I hate that people start with the big picture. Let's start with the things you got to be good at in order for it to all come together. And I kind of want to delete this and make this not all about safe, but it's just that section really struck me, thinking about competency-based views and how to approach creating capability. And I'm going to delete this now, because this isn't about safe, but it was just one of those comparisons that really jumped out. Maybe we'll talk about that on Saturday.
So for me, when I read that, I mean, my brain is always revolving about the solution trains and large solutions. So this is just the thing that I'm thinking about all day. And so I have this fundamental belief that every agile scaling level is completely different from every scaling level before. Like you cannot just deduce or derive that from what you know. You have to make up something completely different. Like and this is also like to a degree true for me, saying, hey, when you really want to understand solution trains, then probably you have to bring a lot of different technologies, like communication and collaboration technologies, together to make that new level work out. So there are a couple of pieces to the puzzle that I think I have with like solution areas or planning conferences and other things. But there are for sure a couple of pieces missing yet, because it doesn't feel complete, at least for me. So and this is something that went through my mind when reading that, saying, okay, what if this is a collection actually of different innovations that or inventions that have to come together to create that innovation. So what do I miss? What is still missing in the whole puzzle, so that in the end it becomes something that feels complete? And so, like, I'm struggling, and I don't have the feeling that it's complete right now, my understanding of solution trains, even though I'm setting that up for more than 10 years now on a regular basis. But so this really resonated a lot with me.
I wonder if there's a linkage, and I've just pasted another diagram onto the Miro. I wonder if there's a linkage there to a lot of the discussions we've been having around trade-offs and structures and value streams, where, and the diagram I've got is Eric's visualization of, you know, solution-centric versus product-centric versus work-centric, and so on and so forth. And that it's establishing the right balance between those that leads you towards a better organization or a more effective organization architecture. I wonder if that's another example of that concept of moving towards the ensemble, because we all tend to have I start looking at something through this lens, as opposed to I need to bring all those perspectives together to get the true next step. And if I've only got one that I'm talking about, I can't. No, it's an interesting buy train.
I would I would want to go back and echo what Eric said, though. I think, assuming we're talking about the same things here, and we may not be, but let me hope we are. But you know, when we build these things like value streams, like solutions trains, these like larger models of things, it's the fundamental elements on which they're being built that can often be the thing that makes the big difference. And I think Senge speaks to things that are just so foundational in nature. Like if you don't get some of these building blocks right to begin with, you're going to hurt, I think, regardless of what model you have for your value streams. If you don't, simple example, if your organization does not respect the need for feedback, fast feedback, and act upon that feedback and make it actionable, it's not, for me at least, it's not going to matter so much as like, oh, but gosh, you've got a very good, you know, topology, team topologies implementation. It looks gorgeous. We just don't bother with the feedback. And I think some of the things that Senge is calling out in his work that's so foundational in nature that maybe we should start there. Because if you can get some of these things right, there's an old adage, a really, really good team of people, they'll make any process work, any approach work, waterfall, agile, something else, doesn't matter. They're going to get it done. And this book gets me excited about what are those foundational things that position them to be in a place where they're just going to get it done.
Yeah, I used to have a quote I would tell leaders that were thinking about Agile. This is back team agility days. And I said, you take your 10 best people and you put them on a new Scrum team. You don't have a Agile pilot, you have a marketing activity. So if you want to get people excited about the success, you just load with your best people and watch them succeed. And everybody wants that, but that doesn't tell you anything.
You've been quiet for a while, Dave. What's going on in that brain?
I was thinking that it's all very well assembling 5 things, right? But there's a lot of work going into making sure they're the right things. And I was reading this other thing. I mean, I was reading this thing about. It wasn't a book that was written that much later. Actually, it was one of Reinertsen's very early books. I'm probably going off topic a little bit about Senge, but it was about the preserving of options that might also be the right options, and you're preserving them far down the path. And it's like the premature convergence of anything is going to be a little bit dangerous, isn't it? So I guess, I mean, I'm approaching it from a slightly different direction. I think, I don't know. I think it's a useful book, but I don't know how to practically use some of these things because they're very theoretical in concept. I don't know. I'm just think my brain's buzzing because there's quite a lot of conversation. And I'm just like trying to think this through and look at the diagrams. It's very interesting.
But are you struggling with something in particular, Dave, that you would like to see in practice, but you can't imagine how that, or is it just generally speaking?
Well, my problems in life with my clients aren't really theoretical. My problem is making them real. So, like for instance, the conversation around team topologies and making sure that feedback loop's in the right place. Absolutely right. You've got to make sure that the feedback loops are in the right place. Or your value stream maps, when you create them, you've got to make sure that you understand where the problems are and fix them bit at a time. So, I mean, it's like I kind of work problem up, not necessarily kind of like from a framework down. I spend my life with people looking at visualizing the problems first and then working up from there, not from looking at applying something big over the top. So, that's why I thought the book was interesting, because my brain doesn't work like that, but it certainly made me start thinking a lot about some of those concepts.
Thank you.
It looked like you were about to jump in a minute ago, Eric.
I was kind of letting the topic drain because I added a few of my other quotes from the section that were inspiring to me to see. And you don't need to jump over, I can hit the highlights, but there were a couple different spots in here. Those top few quotes I dropped in where he goes back and talks about purpose. And this is like 15 years ahead of when many of the people started really highlighting it in the last 6 or 8 years. And Wolfgang's on top of my screen. I can't blocking my view of the quote I wanted to read. But it's hearing him, why can't we do good works at work, in that piece, and the more purpose-based, like purpose-related outcomes that come along with this really struck. And then I read just a few paragraphs later, the entering as bright, well-educated, high-energy people, full of energy and desire to make a difference. By the time they are 30, the rest put in their time to do what matters to them on the weekend. I'm like, that gap And that stark comparison really jumped out at me. Is like, if these tools enable that's tied into my life purpose. Like that's what I want to see more of. So in my head, I thought that was in the introduction because it was like stuck in the density section for me, but it was in the context of looking at the disciplines.
One of the bits I highlighted was this the team learning one of those early ones, and he said, how can a team of committed managers with individual IQs above 120 have a collective IQ of 63?
Yeah.
I thought that was like that's the kind of problem I run into, is that it's like, how do we get people to start to understand how to think in a much more intelligent way about some of the problems they face every day. And that paragraph literally punched me in the face. I was incredible. I just thought, wow, that is so strong. Love that.
I think in that area too, he talks about discussion versus dialogue, which can sound like a bit of a nuance, but it's not. I think it's quite profound, and that that dovetails into just how good are we at listening skills in our organizations, and that we could peel back from that and get back into the education system and just what we teach our children to do in this field. But I found, so one quick thought that I wanted to jump in earlier and chose not to, but I am very respectful of any sense that people get like this whole, it was good stuff, but it seemed a little ethereal, right? It was all up in the clouds, and it sounds great, but could equally perhaps be considered a bit of a mindless aphorism sometimes, as too many of such books can become. But there is a field book that runs parallel to this that also could be worth a look, and that book is trying to help turn the spirit of what's in the fifth discipline into things that are actionable and useful. So I felt I would have been doing my job if I didn't at least share that little insight. And if you all knew it already, my apologies, but I just wanted to share.
I knew there was a field book that existed. I hadn't gone and looked. I think I'm the victim of having bought a lot of field books and then gone, why did I buy the field book? Because I'd read the initial book and then I bought the field book because I loved the initial book, and went, I really didn't get anything from adding the field book to the initial one. Have you played with the field book for this one, Michael? Was it useful, good, value add?
It was. I found it useful, but that was in the same spirit of other people. This was been many years ago that I bought it and took a look at it. If I'm honest, it doesn't sit front and center in any, like, oh, let's go to the field book and let's roll that out for the organization. I haven't done it, and partly because not. I mean, I'll be honest here. The opportunities to take the sort of insights that are in this book and take a run at them, that they don't come along every day, at least not for me in organizations. I mean, it's far more common to be asked, we want you to come in and give a few classes, maybe teach us how to do LPM, and try as you might to say, have you thought about some of these practices in, for instance, Senge's work? And you could end up getting escorted out of the building if you're not careful, and which is a shame. But that's the reality, and like how we sort of cross that bridge between, how do we get people to even be open to the conversations about these things is the challenge. But while I got the floor, I just want to share one thing that I found, and I think it was in this book, not the field book, but there's a place where he lists the state of mind typical people will have with respect. I think it's the shared vision portion. And he calls out everything ranging from apathy, disengagement, many states in between, all the way right up to enrolled, engaged, committed. I built a slide from that, and I put that up during a presentation. And when that slide came up, about half of the phones in the room came up and took a picture of the slide. And so I had to know for sure, but there's something there when people see it like, oh my God, at last someone's brave enough, not me, Peter Senge, someone's brave enough to just say it how it is, that you're likely to see people at all of these sort of ranges of engagement, disengagement, conformity, apathy at times. And I think that's a braver view of the world than we sometimes seem to want to be sort of rolling out when we're trying to teach, we're trying to train, right? Oh, all of these companies, they're full of bright, engaged, enthralled individuals. We just need to tap into, their motivations and so on. It'll get it right. We're not that lucky sometimes, and that's a crying shame. But I find that to be a little bit more realistic, a little bit more practical, based on Senge's description of the sorts of states people are likely to come to you with.
May I ask you a question, Michael? Because there was something what you said that triggered a thought for me. It's like, yes, I know the situation when you're just called in for an LPM training or an implementing safe training or whatsoever into a transformation, and if you would deviate from that a lot, like if you then would start bringing all these ideas into the transformation, as you said, then you would probably not be considered for an additional training. But do you think that, like, I love the frameworks that we have, the agile frameworks like Scrum and Safe and so on, but do you think that it's already the time to create a framework that has all these things baked in and not just an additional thing where you can pay lip service to or not? Do you think we are already there as like a worldwide community that we could create such a framework where this is a substantial part and you cannot leave that out?
I hope I'm not answering a different question. Tell me if you think I am, but I think there are opportunities here. Not a doubt in my mind. Not a doubt in my mind. I think what I see in a lot of organizations is we're beginning to move to the point now where team composition, certain basic agile practices, even teams of teams and arts, it's table stakes. And that seemed very innovative, very advanced. Indeed, at its time, it was. It was a huge step forward. But I see there seems to be a lot of gaps still in whosever framework you want to pick, and the material in. There's one insight in the book where I forget where it lies now, and I apologize. I ventured out of the guardrails a couple of times. I didn't mean to keep doing that. So if I'm doing it too much, they close me down. But there's a place where he calls out where it perhaps might be more about the relationships than the entities themselves. And I think there's something very, very interesting there. And I think it's deceptively simple when said that way. But I'll give you one example of what this is, and then you can tell me if I veered completely off your question. But on that topic of the relationships, when you walk into any company, you can set. Now, I'm not talking about culture here. I'm talking about the energy, like the energy, and it's in the air, it's in the conversations, it's in the interactions, and so I think that's real. I think we give not very much attention, if at all, to this notion of like, ought that to be something where it's okay to have conversations about? Like, why is energy low? If we want to call it morale, it's not just morale we're talking about here, but why is that low? Where's the material that give us some better guidance on improving that? We're talking a little bit about this in Safe now with being in the zone, I think, and that's helpful. I think that's a helpful direction. But I think there's something missing, and that I will come back now to the question: is there an opportunity globally? Is there some possibility of a framework for some of these things? Yes, I think there is. And if I could find something that was doing a good job of that, I'd be proud to go out and try to lead to get some of my contacts to take a look at it, consider, can we at least come in and maybe it's a 2-hour presentation on some things that we think would benefit you greatly. So yes, there's an opportunity.
Thank you.
Unless I'm misunderstanding the question, my perspective is there's probably too many frameworks for these things. like none of the things we've talked about lack models. I'm kind of going back to Dave's conversation about making it useful. Like we've got theories and structures for all kinds of useful things. How do we get people to be aware of when it is time to apply them? Useful, effective, sensitive, all the different elements of right time. Um, in the general coaching community, or ourselves for that matter, like half the time I called on to answer a question, I have like 7 models in my head to pick between. And it's like, which one actually serves this organization best at this time and helps them get somewhere with it? So like what you're talking, Michael, I pulled up a picture of Bridges' transition model and dropped it there. It's like, yeah, there's all those states that Senge talks about is actually right out of old theory. There's William Bridges' work on managing transitions, and multiple books and research papers and everything else written about the journey people go through that then cascades into a number of other models after 12 degrees of watering down that we all use every day. So the question is, how do we get enough depth on one of these things to actually be useful and for people to know when to apply it?
I do agree with that. Not a doubt in my mind. And I just so I'm clear, I wasn't talking about like another fluffy soliloquy from someone on how great it would be if. I think one of the things that was game changing for SAFE when it came along was it was actually quite prescriptive. Before PI planning, there was big room planning, and there was a framework called Fusion. It was utterly ambiguous what a fusion was and when you would use one and what one looks like. Along came a SAFE, put a bit of prescription in place, gave a bit of structure, a bit of guidance, and suddenly it's like, oh my gosh, like that I can do. And so I hope I don't sound like I'm disagreeing with you, Eric. I do agree with you, and I agree with the need for it to be, useful, applicable, and timely in a way. That's a bad word. Guidance in terms of the whens for all of these things, for how to do this, instead of it being just a well-intentioned, noble-sounding call to action, which
I think
goes
the
nowhere.
interesting thing, Michael, you've already mentioned that the field book, which was an attempt, I think, to try and translate the high-level principles of this thing into something more tangible with templates and other things. It was an interesting attempt. I don't know that it worked. I've looked through it as well, and I think it's still a little bit kind of well-intentioned, but it was a long time ago, and it was before a lot of these frameworks became useful things. But it was an attempt, I think, to try and translate some of the high-level stuff into something real and useful. I think he had a go, but I don't think in that time that these things became really useful things. But I think they did have a go, so it was at least a start back then of making it real and useful. It's actually quite an interesting book. I don't know if you can get hold of it, but there is some interesting kind of translations of the high level stuff into something you can actually take away and use.
Yes.
It's quite fascinating.
So I'm gonna distract us again. By the way, Michael, never apologize for a sidetrack in this group.
Oh.
We love sidetracks. I don't think we've ever yet had a discussion on Discord that didn't involve a lot of sidetracks. Because they're the interesting things, right? Because you see something and it makes a connection. But as I listen to you guys talk and sidetrack and re-sidetrack, it reminded me of, I think, one of the quotes that really stood out to me in this chapter. I've got it zoomed in on the screen at the moment. The 5 learning disciplines differ from more familiar management disciplines in that they're personal disciplines. And each has to do with how we think and how we interact and learn with one another.
Yes.
Right. And he riffs on that a lot as the book goes on, with his coming back to this idea of, the problems out there. And that notion the tie back for me back into kind of, I guess, actionable stuff. I've been running a series of facilitation skills workshops with some folks I'm coaching lately. And we're 3 workshops in, and the biggest topic I'm playing with them on is self-awareness. Becoming more self-aware about what's happening in you as you facilitate. And the more that you are self-aware and understanding what's happening in you, the more that you can be effective as a facilitator. And, when you come back to the, what's the latest framework or tool or fuzzy logic, there's that piece where we're always looking for the solution out there. But I think the foundational challenge of a lot of Senge's work is actually, the answers that are inside. And the more that you can start to look at yourself, and I think we can apply this to ourselves as coaches, we can look at those we're coaching and say, what's happening in you that's contributing to the system? Because your influence starts inside you. And, he goes on and, he's got other quotes, and I'm not going to zoom for them at the moment, where he talks about, there's a reciprocal agreement between the organisation and the people in the organisation. You can't have a learning organisation if you don't have an organisation of learners.
Right.
Right. And I'm paraphrasing there, but that kind of internalization of going, I can take every one of these ideas, and I did regularly hold the mirror up to myself and feel very uncomfortable as I was rereading this, to go, I can see how I've represented those failures in my presence in situations as a coach. And if I'm coaching somebody else, because I pretty much never take on that, I'll just turn up and do a training course. If I'm coaching somebody else, helping them be more self-aware of themselves in the system is like the beginning step to actually starting to do something with the system. And I think we so often look for, and this is the peril of the framework, we look for the problem out there. The problem is the framework, or the problem is you chose the wrong framework, or the problem is you didn't choose a framework, right?
That's I really think you're onto something, or it's important because we're all onto something Senge said, that understanding the coach's role in the system, starting with themselves. It's like I shaped my mentorship program to start with like one's own attitude towards agility for the first 2 months of the program. But that's different than saying how does that attitude then influence the system around you? And that second step is critical, I think.
So for me, there's like when I'm thinking about that, there is should I phrase that? It's like when you're playing piano or another musical instrument, and then of course, like when you say to someone, "Hey, play this note," and then there is a sound. But if you are deeper into this music that you're playing, then you're probably hearing a lot of different levels of sound. It's not just like you're pushing the key and then there's a sound, but you will perceive different levels of sound at a certain point in time. And how do I get the people there to be able to perceive these different levels of sound? So it's not just the sound. At a certain point in time, there's music emerging from a sound, and how do you do that? So this is what drives me. Like when I'm setting up solution trains and things, this is what drives me. That it's not just like there is a mechanic in the first place, and this mechanic I can teach. But how do I get the people to that point that a music emerges from the sound? Like there is a larger thing that emerges from the mechanics, and this is, I think this is individually different. What is necessary for a certain person, so that this person is able to like dive into a deeper level of understanding. But it's also a challenge always for me myself, saying, hey, am I already there that I can lead the people there? Or do I have to understand something more meaningful, so that like this ability for them to produce music out of a sound emerges from them when we are like diving in that together? I don't know. Does that make sense for you?
It went very meta, Wolfgang. And I know I
The thing
looked
with
around.
that though is you have a very short feedback loop, don't you? Where when you're doing that, you get
There
a
we
very
go.
quick response. Whereas with an organization, you've got these horrendous, great big long feedback loops, and you don't when you press a key, if you make a note and you get the thing like 10 seconds later, it's like very confusing. That's the organizational equivalent, isn't it? It's like you don't get fast feedback out of these horrendous systems in businesses. I wish we did.
That was a beautiful response, Dave. I watched you looking really contemplative while Wolfgang was speaking, and I was thinking about your comments of making stuff practical.
I got something I'd love to see if we could at least chew on for a moment or two. And it's this question of how ready. Well, I'm just going to use the word leadership in the abstract here. I think you know what I'm talking about when we say leadership. I realize it's a very general terms, and generalizations are dangerous. But leadership in organizations, how ready are they to reflect on, embrace sort of the kinds of things that are in this book? And this might be a misstate the bleeding obvious that's about to get said here, but not all organizations are at the same place. And there are certain situations where it's quite clear, gosh, this could be a really powerful opportunity here. This is my moment. I'm going to seize upon it, and some really great things are about to happen. Equally likely, some companies are a million miles from being prepared to have such a conversation. Now, I'm not saying that you shouldn't try to grab half an hour with someone or half a week if you can get the half a week. But this sense of gauging sort of how ready, there's a big difference between that person who wants LPM training and, you know what, I'm incentivized with my bonus on the final week of December to get a product in the market, and I don't care what it's going to take. Versus the other person who's got, at one point in his book, Senge talks about like the only, in his opinion, it's pretty bold what he says, that the only sustainable model is those companies that are going to continuously learn, which is interesting, a little provocative. But those two extremes, and we see all of them out there in the field, right? And in all spaces in between. I don't know that we have good guidance thinking on from a point of view of how to assess, how to measure, how to inform. Is this too much too soon? Is it the right time? Why do we think so?
I love that. I love that a lot, what you said, Michael, because like this is what I'm thinking about. It's like at a certain point in time, there was this idea in a larger part of the industry that you could probably solve different kinds of problems if you would set up a Scrum team, like say 20 years ago or more. And there was a certain consciousness or a certain awareness that this is a tool that could actually help us in something that we want to solve. Now, with like getting deeper into that movement, then there was more awareness that was created within companies or across company borders saying, hey, there can be even better tools for creating something even more complex. And then less came and safe and the other frameworks. But for me, this was out of a certain necessity that the people in the companies felt themselves saying, hey, we have a certain, even though it might not be like a conscious reflection, but maybe something like a feeling, an unconscious reflection, something saying, hey, we want to solve more complex problems, or are there better tools for doing what we are doing there? And so this was also like the intent of the question that I asked you before, saying, hey, are we at that point that things like that baked into a framework, not just like as an add-on, but really as the core part of a framework, that like there is enough awareness and enough consciousness in the industry to make that a movement if it would be there?
I'm going to jump in there because I don't know that that was the question that I heard Michael ask.
Probably not, but this was what sparked in my mind.
So Wolfgang, I have something to introduce you to, by the way, right? Because we often find that whatever we're talking about, you'll come back to dynamic agility and fracture planes. And Eric put me onto something during the week, and I'd like to introduce you to what I found after he put me onto it.
Is that to encourage me to talk more about it or less?
It's to make you aware that you've gone back to your favorite tree in the woods. So my memory is Michael asked a question about organizations ready to think on the level of provocation about being a learning organization that Senge drives at. And I'm pretty sure I saw Eric start to jump in on it. And then I have something and I'll follow with.
Okay. I want to come at what Michael said from two perspectives. One is the eye of the beholder. Who are we to judge their readiness? And that's a whole secondary conversation we can dig into as we engage with individual leaders and the financial implications if we're in a consulting relationship or a full-time employee relationship. There's like a whole bunch over there around around the judgment side of, do you hold back or not? But the other part, you use the organizational readiness, and I've always looked at it as individual readiness. Who are the individual humans, and are they open to hearing it? And I can only test that by testing, not by guessing. And I found individuals that were open and ready to hear this in the most astounding places. From like, one was a SVP. He was a vice president who owned the entire like claims business area for a company, and like all the claims adjudicators reported into him, like way ahead of technology. And everybody in technology had this like kind of like, oh, he doesn't want any of this, he doesn't get it attitude about this guy. He was such a deep expert in his space that he just discounted everybody's non-relevant comments that had no bearing on his case immediately. And then they all felt that he was checked out. And he took me on a tour of the claim space. I thought he was about to kick me out of the building. He was actually showing me all his cool toys. Because he took me through the back door during an event. And he in the conversation, like this guy who I had no expectation that he would be open to any of this stuff, he's like, we gotta get better at the way we're leading this, because we're not hearing each other. And he started leading into all these things that I would have never opened that can of worms with it. But he was the most fertile ground and most ready to hear it. And that's the area where I got really interested in my own judgment blinders around organizational readiness. Is it time? It's like, no, let's look at each people and just start sowing seeds and see which ones grow. And then pay more attention and put more energy into the seeds that actually start sprouting.
There's actually an example in the book when they do the beer game and the VIP guy jumps to the phone and stops the HR process for getting rid of the.
Yeah.
So sometimes it's the experiential exercise that then turns the light bulbs on, that then goes, oh, now I get it. So that was amazing, wasn't it? I mean, the fact that guy like suddenly said, I've got everything wrong, he would have been the guy that went on and said, right, now we need to try something new. That was so cool. I like that bit.
It's like probably starting with at the beginning and then going slightly more zen. I find companies rarely hire me for the thing they need me for.
Yeah.
And you've got to give them the thing they hired you for to earn the right to give them the thing that they need you for. And it's finding your way through that transition. Like the coaching quote that I live by is, of course, a Jerry Weinberg. Anybody who knows me knows I'll always go back to Jerry, right? Help people see their world more clearly and then let them decide what to do.
Yep.
And I look for tools because it's back to the surprising people you meet inside an organization. And what are the tools that help them to see their world slightly differently, that give them the moment to make a step? Because we can't change organizations. Only the people inside the organizations can change the organizations. But it's where we can help them to see their world a little bit differently and let them see the moments where they can make powerful interventions, that we actually do great stuff. We've just got to sort of earn the right to have the conversations on the right level with the right people to see it happen. I'm going to time check now, because we said, how long are we going to stream for? And I went an hourish. Notionally, this week we were going to talk about all the way to the end of part 2. We've made it to the end of chapter 1 in part 1, and we're an hour and a half. So I'm going to suggest we do. I'm going to suggest we wrap, but what I'd like to do with a wrap is just to do a quick 5 minutes. Hey, we're trying a book club. It's a new thing for all of us, trying a book club together, because we're used to talking cliff notes on an entire book. Let's just do a bit of a reflection on the chat we've had this morning. What did we feel worked well? What would we like to tweak? What would we change about our session next week, in terms of a series of discussions where we dive our way through a book, in this case, the Fifth Discipline.
I loved it. I loved it as we did. So thank you for preparing the mirror board and for structuring the discussion. So, for me, this is exactly what it should be. Like, or what my vision was in the beginning. Say, okay, everyone read the book, or at least to the point where we said we want to go, and then we are not sticking too much on the book itself, but more reflecting on the thoughts or the feelings that we had while we were reading the book, or what came up afterwards when we were thinking about it. So this is much more helpful for me, because like but of course, I read the book myself, and so I know what's inside. But seeing it through your eyes, like this is something that has a tremendous value for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Wolfgang.
I enjoyed it too.
I thought it was really good. Oh, sorry, you go first.
Keep rolling, Michael.
I enjoyed it too. I just love being able to interact with really smart people and get some of your assumptions challenged. Sometimes a little bit of pushback is really, really healthy. Just the opportunity to share a little bit is fantastic. Something I would value, and I hope this is not an inappropriate place to say it, but I don't have clarity on, in the spirit of streaming, how's it going to get used? Is this a practice run? Are these all now live? That sort of a thing. And I sort of willingly flung myself in and started to chat and talk, but that'd be helpful, because I've sort of gleaned a little bit from the chats and stuff without it being crystal clear just yet. But I've loved it. Enjoyed the session.
Awesome. Thank you for the feedback. Just so you know, we've been live, and we'll chat to you. We'll follow up later with, and in actual fact, Eric and I have homework this morning to actually prepare some stuff to share a little bit more about the way the whole community and streaming stuff's moving. So we'll follow up. But yes, you have been live, but we've had no visitors that I know of.
So not quite that live.
Well, it's available for the next 7 days for anybody who goes to Twitch to rewatch, and then we usually do an edit down where we pull out any kind of glaringly horrible moments and stick it on YouTube.
Got it.
Dave.
Yeah, I have to admit, it took me about 20 minutes before I realised the mirror was there. So I had no idea what a lot of the chopping. So I need to learn that bit more. But I thought it was fantastic. I tend to have about 30 books on the go at any one moment, and I read them to try and understand how a piece of the book is relevant to me and my current client and my current situation. So I scream through books super fast, trying to pick out all the relevant bits. So this has made me realize that other people have very interesting perspectives that I would not have realized. So it has made me think. Honestly, my brain has been whirring very, very, not that you can tell, but because my brain doesn't look like it's huge in this tiny head. But it's been really fascinating, and I've very much enjoyed it. It's been a fantastic conversation. I've learned a lot more by listening to you guys than I have by reading the book myself. It was great.
There you go. Thank you. Eric, closing thoughts?
On the spot for the big closing thought. Already it's one of the better book club interactions I've had for my own benefit. Like just the level of conversation, the thought that we've put into it, the engagement that we've all actually read it and had comments, stuff ready to think about and talk about. Deeply appreciate each of you for that. I'm not sure what else I want to say yet. I want to see where it goes. Mark introduced the buzzer or whip or whatever sound we're going to choose to use, but I think each of us has our well-worn thoughts and our favorite trees, and it's going to be interesting watching ourselves to see how much we can keep from coming back to that, each of us individually, because and I haven't had these conversations with you, Dave, or Michael, but I know, Mark, you and I do that same looping if we're not careful and attentive to it. And it's going to be an important one to continue getting value as we explore book after book after book together. So already I'm wanting to architect this, not just experience it, which is probably a good sign. The other thing I'm curious about, and we won't know until somebody tells us, but what it's like for a listener.
Yeah.
Somebody who's coming back to this from the outside, but good for me, is it good for the community? Is our perspectives and what we're sharing going to continue adding value beyond the five of us? So that's the open question I'm leaving with is, are these the RTE +++ conversations that only 4 people will care about? in the world, or is this the useful for every person trying to practice this and every leader out there level conversation? And there's no right answer, but I'm just wanting to get that calibrated in my head a little bit, think about it. What is this actually for?
Lucky we didn't choose a Reinhardt book to start with then, isn't it?
52 lessons later, I'm ready for page 2.
All right, guys, let's wrap. Thank you. It was a fun way to start the day for me. And same bat time and place next week. But of course, we'll be chatting in between on Discord. So have a great day or evening or what's left of a day, depending on your local time zone.
Thank you.